In the quiet solitude of a moonlit forest, where the ancient trees whispered secrets to one another through their rustling leaves, a man named Elias found himself standing face to face with an otherworldly presence. The air around him shimmered with an ethereal glow, and the familiar scent of pine and earth was suddenly infused with something both sweet and metallic, like nothing he had ever encountered before. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure emerging from the swirling mist, a being whose beauty transcended anything human or earthly. She was tall, her lithe form radiating grace and power, wrapped in flowing garments that seemed woven from liquid starlight. Her skin glowed faintly, shifting between hues of silver and pale lavender, while her eyes, those mesmerizing, impossibly large eyes, held galaxies within them. They sparkled with curiosity, intelligence, and something deeper, almost predatory, as though she could see straight through him to whatever truths he might be concealing. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of silken strands that caught the light like spun glass, shimmering with colors no prism on earth could replicate. Elias felt rooted to the spot, his breath hitching as she stepped closer. She moved with an elegance that defied physics, each step leaving behind faint traces of luminescence on the forest floor. Around her neck hung what appeared to be a delicate pendant, but it pulsed softly with an inner light, casting intricate patterns onto the surrounding trees. The pendant seemed alive, responding to her every movement with subtle shifts in color and intensity. On her wrists were bands of some unknown material, sleek yet ornate, etched with symbols that glowed faintly against her luminous skin. Her presence was overwhelming, not just because of her unearthly appearance, but because of the aura she exuded. It wasn't merely beauty, it was authority, wisdom, and mystery all rolled into one. Elias couldn't help but feel small under her gaze, as though this alien princess carried the weight of entire worlds on her shoulders. And yet, there was something disarmingly gentle about her too, a softness in the way she tilted her head, studying him with unspoken questions burning in those cosmic eyes. "What are you hiding, human?" she asked finally, her voice resonating like music made manifest, rich, melodic, and layered with tones that seemed to vibrate directly in his soul. "Let me see." The words sent a shiver down his spine, not out of fear, but because they struck a chord deep within him. He realized then that this encounter wasn't random. Something had drawn her here, to him, and now she stood before him, demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the cool night air. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. How could he explain? How could he possibly articulate the tangled web of guilt, shame, and longing that had haunted him for years? Instead, he looked away, his gaze falling to the ground as if the moss-covered roots of the forest might offer him some kind of solace. But even they seemed to whisper accusations, urging him to confront the truth. The alien princess tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable yet piercing. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them until she was close enough for him to feel the warmth emanating from her glowing form. It was strange, it wasn't heat, exactly, but more like energy, a pulsating force that made his skin tingle and his thoughts scatter. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent shockwaves through his body, as though she were peeling back layers of his very being without laying a hand on him. "You carry shadows," she said softly, her voice tinged with something akin to pity, or perhaps fascination. "They cling to you, heavy and dark. I can feel them. Taste them." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw flickers of anger flash across her face. "Why do you burden yourself so?" He wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of silence, but her grip, gentle though it was, held him firmly in place. There was nowhere to run, no escape from her probing gaze. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though she had stripped him bare with nothing more than a glance. Every secret he'd buried, every lie he'd told, every regret he'd tried to outrun, they all bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill over. He began, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were lies. Lies born of habit, of self-preservation, of the desperate need to keep moving forward without looking back. The princess let out a low hum, a sound that vibrated through the air like the first notes of a symphony. It wasn't mocking or cruel, but it carried an edge of impatience, as though she were growing weary of his resistance. "Do not insult my intelligence," she said, her tone sharper now. You think your frail human emotions are invisible to me? That I cannot sense the storm raging inside you? She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his cheek. Tell me, human, what is it you fear will happen if you speak the truth? Elias flinched, her words cutting deeper than any blade ever could. Fear, that was it, wasn't it? Fear of judgment, of rejection, of facing the consequences of his actions. For years, he had convinced himself that burying his past was the only way to survive, to move on. But now, standing here under the scrutiny of this otherworldly being, he wondered if survival was truly worth the cost. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around his arm, grounding him, forcing him to stay present. You have suffered, she continued, her voice softer now, almost tender. I see it in your eyes, in the way your spirit bends but does not break. But suffering is not meant to be endured alone. It is meant to be shared, understood, transformed. Her words struck a chord deep within him, stirring memories he had long suppressed. Memories of loss, of betrayal, of choices made in moments of weakness that had spiraled out of control. He thought of the people he had hurt, the promises he had broken, the dreams he had abandoned. Each memory was like a shard of glass lodged in his heart, sharp and painful, refusing to fade with time. I've done things, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Things I'm not proud of. Things I can never take back. The princess nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. And these things, they weigh upon you. They shape who you are, how you see yourself. But tell me, human, are you defined solely by your mistakes? Or is there more to you than the shadows you carry? Elias hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was there more to him? He had spent so long believing he was unworthy, irredeemable, that the question itself felt foreign. Yet, as he stood there, enveloped by her presence, he began to wonder. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the shadows didn't have to define him, not entirely. Before he could delve further into his thoughts, the princess released her hold on him and stepped back. She raised her hands, palms facing upward, and closed her eyes. A soft glow emanated from her fingertips, spreading outward in gentle waves. The forest around them seemed to respond, the trees swaying gently as if bowing to her power. When she opened her eyes again, they burned with an intensity that took his breath away. I will show you, she declared, her voice resonating with authority. I will show you the truth of who you are, beyond the lies you tell yourself. Will you allow it? Elias stared at her, torn between terror and hope. To reveal everything, to lay himself bare before her, was terrifying. But the alternative, continuing to live shackled by his own guilt and fear, was unbearable. Slowly, he nodded, bracing himself for whatever revelation awaited him. With a gesture as fluid as water, the alien princess extended her hand toward Elias, her fingers trailing wisps of light that danced like fireflies in the still night air. As her palm hovered near his chest, a surge of energy coursed through him, bright and searing, yet oddly comforting. It felt as though she had unlocked a door deep within his soul, one he hadn't even known existed. Images began to flood his mind, vivid, fragmented flashes of his life unfolding before him like scenes from a fractured mirror. He saw himself as a child, wide-eyed and innocent, running through sunlit fields with laughter bubbling from his lips. Then came darker moments, the arguments with his father, the strained silences at dinner tables where love should have thrived. He relived the day his mother walked out, leaving behind only an empty chair and unanswered questions. Pain lanced through him as he watched himself grow harder, colder, building walls around his heart brick by brick. And then there were the choices, the ones he wished he could erase but couldn't. The betrayal of a friend's trust, the lies whispered in desperation, the promises broken under the weight of his own fears. Each memory burned brighter than the last, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he had buried so deeply. But amidst the pain, there were glimpses of light, small, fleeting moments that had somehow survived the storms. He saw kindnesses he had forgotten. The time he helped a stranger change a tire on a deserted road, the quiet hours spent volunteering at a shelter, the letters he wrote to his sister when she needed someone to lean on. These fragments of goodness flickered like candles in the darkness, reminding him that he was more than the sum of his regrets. The princess watched him intently, her expression unreadable but her eyes shimmering with understanding. "This is who you are," she murmured, her voice reverberating through the torrent of memories. "Not just the shadows, but also the light. Do you see it now?" Elias staggered under the weight of it all, his knees buckling as he fell to the forest floor. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the dew on the grass beneath him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel everything: the sorrow, the guilt, the hope, the love, all of it crashing over him like a tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to cry out against the rawness of it, but no sound escaped his lips. Instead, he simply sat there, trembling, as the alien princess knelt beside him. Her touch returned, this time lighter, almost hesitant, as if she feared breaking him further. "It is not easy to face oneself," she said softly. "But it is necessary. You cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge." He nodded weakly, unable to find words. The memories continued to swirl around him, settling into place like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand what she meant. The shadows were real, they would always be a part of him, but they didn't have to consume him. There was strength in acknowledging them, in owning them, rather than letting them fester in silence. As the intensity of the vision began to wane, Elias became aware of the forest once more: the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. The alien princess remained beside him, her presence steady and grounding. She reached up to touch the pendant at her neck, and it flared briefly with light, illuminating the space between them. "There is more," she said after a pause, her tone carrying a note of warning. "Your past shapes you, yes, but it is not the end of your story. There are paths ahead, choices yet to be made. Some will lead to redemption, others to ruin." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease rippling through him. Redemption. Ruin. The dichotomy weighed heavily on his already fragile state. What did she mean? What choices lay before him, and how could he possibly navigate them when he still felt so lost? Before he could ask, she stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Come," she said, extending her hand to him once more. "There is much we must discuss. Much you must understand before the dawn breaks." Elias hesitated, staring at her outstretched hand. Part of him wanted to refuse, to retreat into the safety of ignorance. But another part, the part that had been awakened by her revelations, knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a shaky breath, he placed his hand in hers and rose to his feet. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. He had no other choice. The alien princess led Elias deeper into the forest, her steps unhurried yet purposeful, as though she knew every twist and turn of the labyrinthine woods. The trees grew denser here, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Shadows pooled around them, thick and velvety, yet the princess's radiant form cast just enough light to guide their way. Elias followed closely, his senses heightened by the eerie stillness that surrounded them. Even the nocturnal creatures seemed to have fallen silent, as if holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. As they walked, the air grew cooler, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that reminded Elias of the moment he had first encountered her. He glanced at her profile, illuminated softly by the glow of her pendant, and marveled at how effortlessly she commanded the environment. It wasn't domination, exactly, more like harmony. She moved as though she belonged here, as though the forest itself recognized her authority and bowed to her will. He wondered briefly if this place held significance for her, or if it was merely a convenient backdrop for whatever revelation awaited him. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing bathed in an otherworldly luminescence. At its center stood a massive stone monolith, weathered by time but etched with intricate carvings that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The designs were unlike anything Elias had ever seen, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from different angles, as though alive. Symbols glowed along the edges of the carvings, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. The sight filled him with awe and unease in equal measure. "This is a place of convergence," the princess explained, her voice low and reverent. "A nexus where realities intersect, where truths are revealed and destinies shaped." She turned to face him, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "It is here that you will learn what lies ahead, and what is required of you." Elias swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Required of me, he echoed, his voice trembling. What do you mean? She didn't answer immediately, instead approaching the monolith and placing her hands on its surface. The moment her skin touched the stone, the carvings flared brightly, bathing the clearing in a kaleidoscope of colors. The ground beneath their feet vibrated faintly, and Elias stumbled backward, startled. The princess remained unfazed, her focus unwavering as she chanted softly in a language he couldn't understand. The words flowed like liquid silver, weaving through the air and wrapping around him like a cocoon. Suddenly, images began to materialize in the space above the monolith. Visions that played out like scenes from a movie projected onto the fabric of reality. Elias watched, transfixed, as the visions unfolded. He saw himself standing on a battlefield, bloodied and battered but resolute, leading others toward some unseen goal. Then the scene shifted, showing him kneeling before a council of beings who bore an uncanny resemblance to the princess, their expressions stern and unyielding. In another vision, he was alone, wandering through desolate ruins, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, clutching a fragment of the glowing pendant she wore. Each image hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and disoriented. What is this?" he stammered, turning to the princess for answers. "Is this the future?" "It is one possible future," she replied, her tone measured but tinged with urgency. "A path among many. The choices you make will determine which becomes reality." She stepped away from the monolith, allowing the visions to dissipate into thin air. "You stand at a crossroads, human. One road leads to redemption, for yourself and perhaps for others. The other," she trailed off, her expression darkening. "The other ends in ruin. Not just for you, but for countless lives." Elias felt the weight of her words settle over him like a suffocating blanket. Redemption or ruin. The stakes were unimaginable, and yet she spoke of them as though they were inevitable. "Why me?" he asked, his voice cracking under the strain. "Why am I involved in any of this? I'm just a man. An ordinary man." The princess regarded him with a mixture of pity and resolve. "You are far from ordinary," she said. "Though you may not see it, you possess qualities rare even among my kind. Strength, resilience, a capacity for growth. But these gifts mean nothing without action, without courage." Her words stirred something deep within him, a flicker of defiance igniting in the pit of his despair. He clenched his fists, feeling the rough texture of calloused skin against his palms. "If I'm supposed to do something," he said, his voice steadier now, "then tell me what it is. Tell me what I need to do." She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the monolith before returning to him. "That knowledge is not mine to give," she admitted. "It must be earned. But know this, the journey ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet comprehend. You will face trials that will push you to your limits, and beyond. And you will not walk this path alone." Before Elias could press her further, the ground beneath them trembled violently, sending shockwaves rippling through the clearing. The monolith's carvings flared once more, brighter and more intense than before, casting jagged shadows across the forest. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second until it became almost deafening. Elias covered his ears instinctively, his knees buckling as the vibrations intensified. The princess raised her arms, her pendant blazing with blinding light. "They are coming," she said, her voice rising above the cacophony. "Prepare yourself, human. Your trial begins now." Elias's heart raced as he struggled to stand, his legs shaking beneath him. "Who's coming?" he shouted, panic clawing at his chest. "What's happening?" But before she could answer, the forest erupted into chaos. Trees groaned and splintered as dark shapes emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct but menacing. The air crackled with energy, and Elias realized with dawning horror that whatever was approaching wasn't natural. It was something else entirely. The princess grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. "Stay close," she commanded, her voice firm despite the turmoil around them. "Do not falter, no matter what you see." Elias nodded numbly, his mind reeling as the first of the shadowy figures stepped into the clearing. Their eyes glowed with malevolent light, and their presence radiated malice so potent it made his skin crawl. Whatever these beings were, they weren't here to negotiate. As the confrontation loomed, Elias felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. This was it, the beginning of the path she had warned him about. Redemption or ruin. Life or death. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The shadowy figures advanced with unnatural speed, their movements fluid yet disjointed, as if they existed between dimensions. Each step they took sent ripples through the air, distorting reality itself. Elias's breath hitched as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. These creatures were not bound by the same rules that governed his world. They seemed to flicker in and out of existence, their forms shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Yet, despite their ethereal nature, their intent was unmistakable. Hostility radiated from them in waves. The alien princess tightened her grip on his arm, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Do not look directly into their eyes," she warned sharply. "Their gaze can unravel your mind." She raised her free hand, and the pendant at her neck flared brighter, casting a protective barrier of light around them. The shadows recoiled momentarily, hissing sounds escaping their distorted mouths, but they quickly regrouped, circling closer. Elias felt the weight of her warning settle over him. He forced himself to keep his focus low, avoiding the glowing, hollow pits where their eyes should have been. His heart pounded wildly, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum signaling impending doom. "What are they?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of snapping branches and unearthly growls. "They are remnants," the princess replied, her tone grim. "Fragments of beings who once sought power beyond their grasp. They exist now only to consume, to feed on fear, doubt, and despair." Her words sent a chill down his spine. "They will try to break you, human. To drag you into their void. You must resist. Resist." The word echoed in his mind, simple yet daunting. How could he possibly stand against such malevolent forces? He wasn't a warrior. He was just a man burdened by his own failures. But even as doubt crept in, something inside him stirred, a spark of defiance ignited by the princess's unwavering presence. If she believed he had strength, perhaps he owed it to himself, and to her, to find it within him. One of the shadowy figures lunged suddenly, its claw-like hands reaching for them. The princess reacted instantly, raising her hand and unleashing a burst of searing light. The creature shrieked, its form dissolving into wisps of darkness before reforming several paces away. It snarled, baring jagged teeth that glinted like shards of obsidian. More of them closed in, their numbers growing as if summoned from the very fabric of the night. "We cannot stay here," the princess said urgently. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, she pulled him forward, breaking into a sprint toward the edge of the clearing. Elias stumbled after her, his legs protesting under the strain. Behind them, the shadows gave chase, their movements erratic but relentless. The forest seemed alive with menace now, every tree and bush conspiring against them. Roots snaked across their path, threatening to trip them, while low-hanging branches whipped at their faces. Elias ducked and weaved, his lungs burning as he struggled to keep up. The princess moved with impossible grace, her glowing form illuminating their way like a beacon. Yet, no matter how fast they ran, the shadows remained close, their guttural cries reverberating through the trees. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, plunging them into darkness. Elias cried out as he tumbled downward, landing hard on a surface that felt both solid and yielding, like packed earth softened by moss. Pain shot through his side, but adrenaline dulled the worst of it. Blinking rapidly, he looked around, trying to orient himself. They were in a cavern, its walls lined with bioluminescent fungi that cast an eerie greenish glow. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decay. The princess landed beside him with far more composure, rolling gracefully to her feet. "Are you injured?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. "I'm fine," Elias gasped, pushing himself upright. His ribs ached, but he ignored the discomfort. "Where are we?" "A refuge," she replied, scanning their surroundings. "For now." Her expression darkened as she added, "But they will find us soon enough." As if on cue, the distant sound of skittering echoed through the cavern. The shadows were coming. Elias felt panic rise again, but this time, he fought to steady himself. He couldn't afford to lose control. not when so much depended on him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steadier than he expected. The princess turned to face him fully, her luminous eyes locking onto his. "You fight," she said simply. "Not with weapons, but with resolve. These creatures thrive on weakness, on fear. If you let them see yours, they will tear you apart." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Fear, that old companion he had carried for so long, wasn't going to save him now. In fact, it might be the very thing that destroyed him. He nodded slowly, determination beginning to replace the terror in his chest. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Tell me what I need to do." She reached up to touch her pendant, which pulsed rhythmically in response. "Focus on your light," she instructed. "The part of you that refuses to be consumed. Let it guide you." With that, she stepped back, giving him space. Her trust in him was palpable, and it bolstered his courage. The skittering grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of displaced air. Shadows began to seep into the cavern, pooling at the edges before taking shape. One by one, the creatures emerged, their glowing eyes fixed on Elias. Their forms writhed and twisted, exuding an aura of pure malice. Elias clenched his fists, grounding himself. He thought of everything he had seen in the visions, the battlefield, the council, the ruins. Redemption or ruin. Life or death. This was his moment to choose. Drawing a deep breath, he focused inward, searching for that flicker of light the princess had spoken of. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. But as he concentrated, it grew stronger, warming him from the inside out. The lead shadow lunged, its claws extended. Acting on instinct, Elias raised his hand, willing the light within him to manifest. To his astonishment, a burst of golden energy erupted from his palm, striking the creature squarely in the chest. It let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving into nothingness. Stunned, Elias stared at his hand, hardly believing what he had just done. The princess smiled faintly, pride flickering in her eyes. "Good," she said. "Now finish it." More shadows surged forward, their attacks relentless. But Elias stood his ground, channeling the light within him with increasing confidence. Each strike drove them back, weakening their hold on the cavern. Though exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he refused to yield. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Yet, as the battle raged on, a new sound reached his ears, a low, resonant chanting that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The princess froze, her expression turning grave. "No," she whispered, her voice tinged with dread. "It's too soon." Before Elias could ask what she meant, the ground beneath them trembled violently. From the depths of the cavern, a massive figure began to rise, a towering amalgamation of shadow and bone, its eyes blazing with ancient fury. This was no mere fragment. This was something far greater, far older. And it had awakened. The princess stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and the behemoth. "Stay behind me," she commanded, her voice steel. But Elias knew this fight wasn't hers alone anymore. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, not out of obligation, but because he finally understood what was at stake. Redemption or ruin. The choice was his to make. The cavern shook violently as the towering behemoth rose higher, its skeletal frame wrapped in writhing shadows that pulsed with malevolent energy. Its eyes burned like twin suns, casting an oppressive heat that made the air shimmer and warp. The princess stood firm, her pendant glowing brighter than ever, but even she seemed diminished in the presence of this ancient force. Elias could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush his resolve. "You cannot defeat it alone," the princess said without turning, her voice strained yet resolute. "It is a manifestation of despair, an embodiment of all the fears and regrets you have buried within yourself." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had faced fragments of his past before, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just a memory or a shadow, it was the culmination of everything he had tried to escape. Every lie, every betrayal, every failure. He saw them reflected in the behemoth's fiery eyes, staring back at him with merciless clarity. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to steady it. What if I'm not strong enough? The princess glanced over her shoulder, her expression softening for a brief moment. Strength is not the absence of fear, human, she said gently. It is the willingness to face it head-on. You carry light within you. Light forged from your struggles, your pain, your hope. Trust in it. Trust in yourself. Her words resonated deeply, stirring something primal within him. He thought of the visions he had seen, the battlefield, the council, the ruins, and realized they weren't prophecies so much as possibilities. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but neither was ruin. The future was still unwritten, shaped by the choices he made in this moment. Summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, Elias stepped forward, standing beside the princess. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady now, filled with quiet determination. She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Together," she replied. "We fight together." With that, she raised both hands, her pendant erupting in a blinding surge of light. The cavern walls trembled as beams of radiant energy shot outward, striking the behemoth and forcing it to recoil. But the creature recovered quickly, its roar shaking the very foundations of the earth. Shadows lashed out like whips, slicing through the air toward them. Elias acted instinctively, raising his hand once more. This time, the golden light flowed effortlessly, forming a barrier that deflected the attacks. The warmth spread through his body, filling him with a sense of purpose he had never known. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something greater, for the chance to rewrite his story, to prove that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. The battle raged on, each side locked in a desperate struggle. The princess unleashed wave after wave of searing light, her movements precise and calculated. Elias followed her lead, channeling his inner strength into bursts of energy that pushed the behemoth back step by agonizing step. Yet, no matter how many times they struck, the creature refused to fall. Its wounds healed almost instantly, its power seemingly endless. "We're not hurting it enough," Elias shouted, frustration creeping into his voice. "There has to be another way." The princess hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, as if struck by sudden realization, her eyes widened. "Its core," she exclaimed. "The source of its power. It's inside. We must destroy it." Before Elias could respond, the behemoth let out a deafening roar, sending a shockwave that knocked them both off their feet. Pain exploded across his back as he hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Through blurred vision, he saw the princess scramble to her feet, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. Despite her injury, she moved with unyielding determination, launching another attack that forced the creature to stagger backward. "Go," she commanded, gesturing urgently toward the behemoth's chest. "I'll hold it off. You find the core." Elias hesitated, torn between obeying her order and staying by her side. But one look at her fierce expression told him there was no room for argument. Clenching his jaw, he surged forward, dodging the flailing shadows and focusing on the pulsating mass of darkness at the creature's center. As he drew closer, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the behemoth's despair was trying to drag him under. He reached out with trembling hands, the golden light flaring around his fingers. The moment he touched the core, a jolt of pure agony coursed through him, threatening to overwhelm his senses. Memories flooded his mind, every regret, every mistake, every moment of weakness, all amplified to unbearable levels. He screamed, his knees buckling as he fought to stay conscious. But amidst the chaos, he heard her voice, clear and unwavering. "Do not falter, human. Destroy it." Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Elias drove the light deeper into the core, willing it to consume the darkness. The behemoth let out a final ear-splitting shriek as its form began to disintegrate, collapsing inward like a dying star. The cavern shuddered violently, chunks of rock falling from the ceiling as the creature dissolved into nothingness. When the dust settled, Elias collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His body ached, his mind reeling from the ordeal. Through bleary eyes, he saw the princess approach, her steps slow but steady. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "You faced your darkness and prevailed." Elias managed a weak smile, exhaustion overtaking him. "Does this mean redemption?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She studied him for a long moment, her luminous eyes reflecting the complexity of his journey. "Redemption is not a destination, human," she replied. "It is a path, one you must walk every day. But today, you took the first step." As dawn broke outside the cavern, bathing the world in soft golden light, Elias felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The shadows were gone for now, but he knew the battle wasn't truly over. There would always be challenges ahead, moments when doubt and fear would creep back in. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. And as the alien princess helped him to his feet, her presence a comforting anchor in the uncertain days to come, Elias realized something profound. He wasn't alone. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, not just for himself, but for the fragile, beautiful spark of hope that had been reignited within him. The end was not the end. It was only the beginning.